Let's welcome Richard Holton from Cambridge, talking about intentional verbs.
It's very nice to be back. Thank you for having me. I'm going to get filmed. Does that mean I have to stand somewhere in particular?
No, I'll zoom in and out if you move a lot. It's fine. Do your thing.
All right. I kind of need the handout, so I'll sort of be roughly that. Okay, so yeah, most of us have just been in a conference which was pre-read. This is not, but there is a handout. So some of you pre-read the handout. Like the handout. All right, so I want to talk about intentional verbs, and in particular think a bit about what their moral importance is, and whether there are any interesting things to be got from them. It's very exploratory. I really don't have terribly fixed views on whether or not there are useful things to be got here, so we will see as we go on. So some action verbs, perhaps all action verbs, although I don't really have a good independent criterion for an action verb, but certainly some action verbs seem to be intentional in the sense that their application requires a certain intention or some other kind of mental state for that application to be apt. So, a neat way of getting at this, of course, is just to look at some examples. So, I put on the handout: to murder, to steal, to harass. Right. If you murder someone, that requires a certain state of mind. Whether that is an intention, whether that is something intentional is an issue we will come back to. But certainly the law recognizes that when it thinks that most criminal offenses have two parts: a mens rea, a guilty mind, and an actus reus, the guilty action. There are another set of verbs which I think are still action verbs, although some people might dispute that. I have here to kill, to drop, to fidget. Now, to kill someone does not require a certain state of mind, or if it does, it's a very, very etiolated one indeed. I think it doesn't. So you can kill someone by doing something which just has the consequence that they die. It's a basically causal notion. There doesn't have to be any particular mental state that accompanies that. Now, one interesting thing, I think, is that the intentional verbs seem to be absolutely central to our moral discourse in a way that the non-intentional ones typically aren't. Now, when I say central, I suppose I have two things in mind. So the Ten Commandments first. One of those is translated as "thou shalt not kill." That's a mistranslation. It should be translated as something much more like "thou shalt not murder." They're all done in terms of intentional verbs. The common law, and in fact the criminal law more generally, is phrased almost entirely in terms of intentional notions. At least those are the kind of beginning ones. And then it generalizes outwards to other things, but it typically then keeps those with an intentional component as well. And that's reflected in the fact that at least the criminal law typically has a mens rea commitment, and that mens rea commitment is normally built into the very verb. So whilst we don't just have to murder, we also have to manslaughter. Manslaughter itself has an important mens rea component. So one way you can get at this distinction is by thinking, well, does adding he unintentionally or she unintentionally did this render the verb wrong in some way? So if you said, she unintentionally murdered him, well, of course, we'd make some sense of it because we're always charitable. But it's not a good thing to say. Right? You just confuse people if you said something like that. Conversely, does adding intentionally add something to it? So if you say she intentionally murdered him, it looks like you haven't, maybe there's a slight difference of emphasis there, but you haven't really made much difference to the verb by adding the intentional there. Whereas if you said she intentionally killed him, that would have made a large difference to simply saying that she killed him. So you can take those to be the obvious kind of tests. What I want to look at is what the relation between, put in the legal sense, the mens rea and the actus reus is. So what's the relation between the intentional component within one of these verbs and what you might think of as the behavioral component, where behavior should be understood in a very thin sense, that is, having factored out the intentional notion. At least to say that is to make the question, though, because I think the real question, or at least the question I want to examine today, is whether we should think of these intentional verbs as decomposable into two independent elements: an intentional element and a non-intentional bodily movement style element, such that we can think of the verb as expressing the conjunction of those two things. Or, conversely, are they much more intimately connected in such a way that we can't straightforwardly disentangle them? Now, people might be reminded here of a big discussion within ethics, within both normative ethics and meta-ethics, as to whether or not there are thick moral verbs. That is, are there moral descriptions that involve such an intermeshing of the evaluative and the descriptive component that those two can't be independently separated. So what I'm looking at, if you like, is the analogue to the thick moral verbs for something like thick intentional verbs. So you could phrase the question, are there such things as thick intentional verbs? And if there are, what kind of lessons should we draw from that? I'm actually going to say probably more about, there should be a handout for you.
Okay.
There, he's got it.
Thank you.
I'm interested in those lessons whether or not we think it's true, right? So a lot of this is just kind of exploratory. You can think of it as conditional. If there were such, what would follow? So for some of you who just get off the bus straight to begin with, you can think of this as this interesting little intellectual exercise of no actual import. For others, it might be more so. All right. I actually started thinking about this by thinking about the law itself, so thinking about the relation of actus reus to mens rea. And in particular, thinking about the relationship of attempted crimes to successful crimes. So there's an actual way of thinking about this if you think that the mens rea and the actus reus can be distinguished, easily separated. You think roughly the following. Look, if you have the actus reus, the guilty action, without the mens rea, then you don't have the crime, you just have an accidental killing, say, if we focus on murder. If you have both the actus reus and the mens rea, then you have the full crime, then you have murder. If you have the mens rea without the actus reus, plus you need to have got some way down the path, then you have an attempted crime. Okay, that's a very natural way to look at it, and I think that's the way you do see it described in a lot of legal texts. Something along those lines. But then there are three problems that come up. One of them is talked about a lot, the second somewhat, and the third very little. So the one that's talked about a lot is, why is attempt punished less severely in most jurisdictions than successful crime? I mean, it isn't, actually the letter of the English law is such that you should punish them equally severely, but they're very rarely punished equally severely. In very, very many jurisdictions, they are explicitly distinguished in the severity of punishment. That's always seen as kind of puzzling, right? Because whether you've got a theory which says you're just trying to give a disincentive, then the disincentive surely should be to, embarking on trying to do these things. Or if instead you think of it in terms of kind of natural justice, well, surely it was the trying that it was the guilty mind that should be punished, whether or not it comes off. That should be neither here nor there. So there's that puzzle. I'll say a little bit about that, but I'm not primarily addressing that puzzle. Much more interesting, I think, are the other two. So, firstly, let's take murder. Murder, certainly in English law, has been a somewhat changing doctrine as the case law has evolved over the last 40 years or so, in terms of how much foresight is needed for a crime to count as murder. It's ended up with the view that it has to be something like a moral certainty, and by that the law means it's really almost inconceivable that this wouldn't have been the outcome that you would have expected to eventuate from what you did. So for instance, if you burn down someone's house while they're inside it, it's a moral certainty that they're going to die and you're likely to be up for a murder charge. If you do something which has some chance of killing someone, then maybe you wouldn't now under English law be up for a murder charge. But if it's complete foresight, if it's completely foreseen, if that amounts to something approaching knowledge that that's going to be the outcome, then it will be a murder charge. Even if it was not in the simple sense the thing that you were intending to do, in the sense that suppose the person had not been in the house, would you have avoided setting fire to it, waiting for them to come back? Right? Would you have chased them down the garden with your firebomb? That surely is a mark of your intention being to kill them. That doesn't need to be true for you to be found guilty of murder if you firebomb the house and the person is inside. Similarly, a much discussed case, if you put a bomb on an aeroplane wanting to claim the insurance money, it goes off and it kills the pilot, that was a moral certainty. You'll be charged with murder for that and you'll be convicted. If, on the other hand, you had wanted to kill the pilot and you realized the pilot wasn't going to be flying that plane, presumably you wouldn't have put the bomb on. That doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. But here's the interesting thing, and this is not very much talked about. Third thing, the mens rea for attempt does not generalize in that way. At least, slightly problematically, under Scottish law it does. But in most Scottish law and Colorado, a few other places, the mens rea for attempt just follows the mens rea for the offence. But in most jurisdictions, it doesn't. So, if you put a bomb on the plane, or at least you're planning to put a bomb on the plane, and you get arrested before you've done it, so it never goes off, you will be found guilty of attempting to do various criminal activities, but you won't be found guilty of attempting to murder the pilot. Now you might think that's just a feature of the law, right? That's just a strange thing that's happened in the law. I suspect it's not. I suspect there's actually something very intuitive and natural in that, which explains why in most jurisdictions, as I say, these two things have come apart, the mens rea for the attempt and the mens rea for the crime. And the natural way to think about that is that you weren't intending to kill the pilot, and when you're got for attempt, what you're doing is for attempting to do something. And in this case, you weren't attempting to kill the pilot. So you weren't attempting murder in that way. Tricky though. My suggestion, actually, once we start to think that you can't pull the mens rea apart from the actus reus, we'll start to have some explanation for why the law works in that way. Okay? So that's what I want to do. I want to first argue that in this particular case in the law, those two are not separable. And then I want to go on and ask what consequences that has for a few other things. Okay. There are two different ways of thinking about this. I'm not quite sure which one I want to focus on. So I'll put them both down and I'll, I'm afraid, move rather freely from one to the other. And I hope I won't cause confusion by doing that. But one thing you might think is that if they were separable, then you would have this claim that I put as the weaker thesis under two forms of independence. If F is an intentional verb, then there's some non-intentional verb such that to F is to intentionally G. Right, well if that were true, then presumably, I don't think it actually logically follows, but there's a natural way of thinking that would enable you to separate the two out, right? Because then you'd have the action, which could be characterized independently of any kind of intention, and then you just add to it that it was intentionally done, and that would get you the mens rea. That would get you the mens rea. Okay, there's a slightly stronger thesis, and part of this comes up because if you look at what the law is requiring, it doesn't simply require the mens rea, right? It doesn't say I don't know what the Latin would be. It doesn't say it's a guilty intention. It says it's a guilty mind, right? It's just a mental state. So it doesn't really matter what kind of mental state it is. The law could accept various different sorts of mental state. And in the case of foreknowledge, you might think that's just to do with belief. Right? So there's a much broader thing which doesn't try and tie this to issues of things done intentionally, but ties it to mental states much more broadly construed than that. I'm not going to be focusing on that, and I'll try and give some reason why you should be able to think of those notions like foreknowledge in terms of a certain kind of intentionality, where intentionality is not understood in the philosophical sense, but in the kind of non-philosophical sense where you just say you could characterize this as something that was done intentionally. I'll try to say something about defending that a bit later. I won't say that for now. Okay. But how should we go about thinking about this? Well, as I said, one model for all this is to think in terms of the thick moral constructions. The other obvious way to think of it using recent machinery is in terms of Tim Williamson's discussion of the primeness of knowledge. I actually think that's a useful way to think about this. So what I want to do is to follow Williamson in his way of thinking about knowledge and see whether a similar kind of argument can be applied in the case of murder. Okay, so how does Williamson get to where he gets to? And most of you will probably be very familiar with this. Williamson, I think, is moved first by the thought that various reductive accounts of knowledge seem to have been unsuccessful. In fact, it's almost comical how unsuccessful, given the amount of energy that's gone into analysing knowledge, they have been. So one response to that is just to think, well, maybe it's not an analysable notion. I take it that's one thing he thinks. But he also actually thinks something more than that, something which is actually, I think, independent of that. Namely, that knowledge can't be decomposed into a mental and a non-mental element. Right, now, I take it the justified true belief conception is a way of trying to decompose it into mental and non-mental elements, although it's not altogether clear where you put the justification when you're doing that. But at the very least, truth you might think of as a non-mental element, belief you might think of as a mental element, and then whatever else is there in knowledge, you might try and apportion either in with the truth side or in with the belief side. That is, either in with the non-mental state or in with the mental state. Being able to factor into the non-mental and the mental, Williamson thinks of as it being a non-prime concept. So if you can do that, it's a non-prime concept. If you can't do that, it's a prime concept. So prime here means specifically you can't factor it into a mental and a non-mental feature. Nonetheless, for Williamson, knowledge entails belief and it entails truth. But you shouldn't muddle up those entailment relations with the thought that it can be built out of the things which it entails. Useful analogy here which Williamson makes, think of the relation of, say, red to being coloured. If something's red, then it's certainly coloured, so being coloured is entailed by being red. But you don't want to think of being red as being constructed out of being coloured plus some other feature, right? That would be clearly a crazy way to think about it. There isn't something that can be added to being coloured that gives it the redness. Think of it simply as that there being an entailment there. Okay. So how do we get that for knowledge? Well, Williamson has an argument for it, which is a kind of mix and match style argument. What he argues is that if you can take cases of knowledge, two different successful cases of knowledge, and try and take the mental element of one and the non-mental element of the other, and they're both knowledge of the same thing, then you should be able to mix up, if the mental element and the non-mental element are truly independent, you should be able to mix them up. And in mixing them up, you should be able to generate a new example of knowledge. So he gives a lot of examples of this in his book. To give you one, to give a flavor of it, suppose you have a person who is listening to two other people who are giving them testimony. So, we have A giving testimony and B giving testimony. In the first case, A is reliable and B is not reliable. In the second case, B is reliable and A is not reliable. But let's assume, so in this case, the listener trusts A, who's reliable and forms the belief that the party they've been to was a good party. Doesn't listen to B. In this case, knows B to be reliable, trusts B. B says that, forms the right belief. In a third case, trusts in effect the wrong person, but the wrong person is saying the right thing. Then you've got the right internal setup from one case with the right external setup from the other, and yet we don't think of it as a case of knowledge. Why not? Because given that it's the unreliable person who happens to be saying the right thing, it looks like luck that they've managed to form the right kind of belief. This is the kind of recipe that is a recipe for Gettier-style cases, I take it. You can think of this as you think of Williamson's approach as basically taking Gettier cases and kind of giving a general recipe for the kind of thing that's going on in them. Okay, so, question. Could you come up with an analogous case in the case of murder? Well, let's first think about a kind of Murdy-Gettier case, and then we can construct a sort of mix and match argument out of it. Here's the Gettier case. So, the defendant intends to kill the victim with some poisonous tablets. The police have been watching. They remove the tablets and substitute some others that are apparently harmless. It turns out, though, that they contain a food colouring to which V is remarkably and unknown to them or to anybody else, highly allergic. Defendant gives them to the victim. The victim takes them and dies. Would this be a case of murder? Well, it would be nice if I could give you a real case along these lines. I have checked the case books and talked to various criminal lawyers. There don't seem to be any real cases of quite this form, unfortunately. However, this is a paradigm first-year crim exam question. And the correct answer to this, if you get this in your first-year criminal law exam, is no. D would not be guilty of murder in this case. At most, D would be guilty of attempted murder. Why not guilty of murder? Well, because the causal chain didn't go through in the kind of way it should have done. However, contrast it with two other cases. One where D's mental state is exactly the same as in this one, but in which case the police aren't watching and the person just takes the pills and dies. So there you have the same internal state, but a different external state. Contrast this, another case where D knows that the police are watching, knows that the victim is allergic to the pills that the police are going to put in, thinks, aha, this is a way that I can kill them and at most face an attempted murder charge. And I know, see point 1 of the handout, that attempted murder is typically punished less than murder. So I will go through with this, using this method, and the police will substitute and they will take it. Under that circumstance, if it was found out that D actually knew all this, of course D would be guilty of murder. So we have a mix and match style case. Right? That is, we have a case where we take the internal feature, the mental features from one case of murder, we put it with the external features of another case of murder, and you put them together and you don't get a case of murder. At most, you get a case of attempted murder. So my suggestion, if Williamson is right about the knowledge cases, then this looks an equally good argument in the legal case. Of course, you might say to this, look, what this has shown is that no one really thinks that this is just conjunction. I mean, what you've got to think is that what you do is you put together an internal state and an activity, and you think of the internal state and the activity as related given the right causal way. Yes, you might think that. Of course, then the question is, what's the right causal way? So this is where I think actually Williamson's considerations about primeness just come back to the skepticism about success based on inductive evidence of failure. Namely, we just haven't come up with anything that looks like the right way. Maybe at some point we will come up with an account of what looks like the right way. But unless we do, the evidence is mounting up that actually these aren't separable. So just, if I can just speak very impressionistically about how I think of the sort of Williamson way of thinking about it and how I want to think about the analogous case here. I take it Williamson thinks that in a case of knowledge, there are too many little connections between the thinker and the world that keep happening all the way through too many bits and bobs for it to be possible to decompose the internal and the external in the right kind of way. Because you keep getting evidence in, you keep tracking, you keep responding to it. That's what happens in a typical case of knowledge. So if you try and break those apart, you actually can't succeed in doing it. You've got to see it in terms of this set of ongoing interactions. I think the same way for most of these thick intentional actions. It's not in the typical case that you just kind of see something, decide on it, push a button, and off it goes. Actions are things that typically unroll over time, and they involve a constant tacking and changing as you change what you're doing in response to how you think the world is evolving in response to what you're doing. And that's what I think is the underlying picture there. Of course, that means that at the extremes, you can come up, or you can attempt to come up with skeptical scenarios where you actually replicate that. The question is how much do those skeptical scenarios show? And the answer from this is that they don't show very much, because in effect, those skeptical scenarios are beholden to the successful, genuine scenarios, because what they're doing is just imitating what is going on normally in the ongoing interactions. Okay. Well, now let's think about this then. Now let's think about what we get from this if we push it a little bit further. If this is right, then when you look at the offence of murder, you can't think, here's the mens rea for it, now let's apply that to the case of attempted murder. Because the mens rea for murder will be intertwined with activities that actually constitute murder. And of course that's got there in the notion of intentionally murdering someone. That's redundant, but I don't think it's unhelpful, because you think that what's being done is something intentional. So what is useful about stressing that an intentional murder is just to highlight the fact that this is an intentional concept. And so you can't say, look, if those two are totally enmeshed, you can't say in the case of attempted murder, what you have is all of that, but without the killing. Because that was exactly what you thought you couldn't have. You can't have that in those interactions without the killing being there. So you have to have a separate mens rea for attempt to the one that you have for the successful case. Okay, so now let's think about the two kinds of mens reas for the two cases. Think a little bit about murder. As I say, it's much discussed and much disputed in real jurisdictions as to just how much foresight should be there in the case of murder. it certainly isn't just a case, I think, of straight out intentional killing. And it's not that for a number of reasons. Part of also what is what adds great complication to this area is the well-known finding from Josh Knobe and other people that when we talk about intentionally doing a bad thing, it seems that is very different from what happens when we talk about intentionally doing something which we don't think of as bad. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about that and then sketch one way of thinking about that, which might be helpful here. So again, I expect many of you are very familiar with these cases. So in the original Knobe case, you ask subjects to consider various different stories. In the first story, you have the boss of a business who is, they make widgets of some kind, and some underling comes along and says, we found a way of making a new widget very cheaply. It'll make us tons and tons of money, but it'll have the effect of polluting the local river very badly. And the boss says, look, I couldn't care less about the river. I'm a businessman. I'm here to make money. We're going to go ahead. We're going to make the widget, and we're going to make a lot of money. And then you ask the ordinary subjects, did he intentionally pollute the river? And you find that somewhere over 70% of people say yes, he intentionally polluted the river. You now tell exactly the same story to another group of subjects. You don't want them to have prior commitments as to what counts as intentional. And you just change the story so that instead of it polluting the river, it benefits the river. So when the guy comes in, he says the result will be the river will be improved and the fish will come back and kingfishers will... They didn't actually put this much in the story, but you can imagine what you're doing. And he says, I couldn't care less about the river, right? I'm a businessman, I'm here to make money, let's go ahead. And you ask people, did he intentionally benefit the river? And you get almost exactly the flip side. You get somewhere between 70 and 80% of people saying, no, he didn't intentionally benefit the river. There's highly much discussion as to how to understand this. One thing you might think then is that intentional vocabulary is itself already morally charged. So when you talk about someone doing something intentionally, you've already added in a moral consideration there. That would, of course, show that this is, if that were true, that would suggest at least at the kind of folk level, the picture is even more complicated than I've been suggesting. Namely, that probably it's not just the intentional and the behavioral that come in together, it's the intentional, the behavioral, and the evaluative all get bundled up together in the way that people make these judgments. I actually think that doesn't quite wash, but I think the way it doesn't wash tells a rather interesting lesson. The reason I think it doesn't quite wash, there were some other experiments that Knobe did early on that involved some rather different cases. So for instance, instead of thinking just of the CEO in this case, you think of the CEO under some pernicious regime. I think he had it under Nazi Germany. And there's some legal rule which requires that you submit the racial data of your employees to the authorities. And they will use these data for some appalling end of their own. And now you have this, the guy comes and says the same thing, right? We're going to make these widgets. But doing so means that we will either in one case conform to the law, which requires us to give the data, and in the other case, we will violate the law, which requires us to give the data. And you ask in those cases, does the guy do the conformity or the violation intentionally? And what you find is that people say in the case where they're not giving the data, now that's the morally good case, I take it, given that these are Nazis and are going to do bad things with the data. But that's the case in which they think he intentionally violated the law. Right? Whereas the other case is the case where they don't think he intentionally obeyed the law, even though obeying the law is the bad thing. So it's much more complicated than just is it a good thing or a bad thing that's being done. My suspicion here actually is that there is a distinction between our understanding of conformity and our understanding of violation. That is, we think of conformity as requiring being guided, right? To conform to the law in the way that people are intuitively thinking of this. Yes, that's right. To conform to the law is to be guided by the things that the law says. It's like being law-abiding. Whereas you violate something just by going against it. It's not that you need to be moved by an aim to go against it, right? Contrast this, this I think is something that is there in all of these, it's actually quite pervasive in these cases. So, in the case of killing, what's turning it into murder isn't that you have to be in the business of planning to kill the person, but it's something more like you disregarding some kind of moral requirement on not exposing people to the kind of danger which your actions are going to expose them to. Now, is that now intentional? Well, yes, you might think it's intentional, because you might think that's an intentional violation. And all that's needed for an intentional violation is that you disregard the norm which you should be guided by. Right? Unlike the case of conformity, where just happening to conform to it isn't good enough for the thing that you want for intentional conformity. Okay, so I think actually you might think that even if you put kind of foresight in there as the mens rea for murder, you might still think that it's intentional. But what's intentional here is not an intentional killing. It's an intentional disregard of a certain kind of norm which should be. Our intuitive thought is should be guiding. Okay, so that's roughly what I think about the mens rea for murder. It's more complicated than that, though, because even if you get to that position, there are lots of exceptions. So self-defense is an exception. Killing in time of a war is an exception. Executing a justly sentenced person in a regime that has capital punishment counts as an exception. None of these are cases of murder, even if you don't approve of them. So even if you think there are intentional violations of certain norms, you've got to think of those norms themselves as including exceptions in these further cases. So it's a complicated, very, very complicated picture, I think, which finally emerges. But that's what's there for murder, for the mens rea for murder. What about the mens rea for attempt? Well, if you can't separate out the mens rea from the actus reus in the right way, you've got to have a separate mens rea for attempt. What's that? Well, it's attempting. And now we understand attempting in the straight out way that you've got an intention to do a certain kind of thing. Now again, interestingly, if you look at the node findings, people are much more ready to say that the CEO in the initial case intentionally polluted the river than they are to say he had an intention to pollute the river. Most subjects don't say that. They don't think that there's any kind of plan, because to have an intention would require him dumping stuff in the river, whether or not that was going to make him a profit. He doesn't have that. So suggestion, the mens rea for attempt is actually something like having an intention, and that's why these two pull apart so radically. Okay. Now there's still a question as to why they should be punished differently. But in some ways that question should, given that now the two offences are looking very different, you might say, well, why should they be punished the same? I mean, there's no obvious reason why they should be punished the same. It's just an open question whether or not the jurisdiction should think they should be punished in a different way. Okay, where have I got to? I've got quite a few more things I'd like to say, so I'm going to skip a few things. Let me just go on to now look at two further possible applications. And this, as I say, is where I'm very open-minded, so I welcome discussion. But suppose you buy what I've argued for so far, namely that you can't readily separate the actus reus and the mens rea. You can't readily separate the action and the mental state. What implications does that have? Two areas I want to examine. First one, doctrine of double effect. How do you think of the doctrine of double effect? Well, very often it's thought of in the following way. take two actions which are the same, but for one of them have a certain kind of intention and the other one don't. Now, one of those is meant to be permissible and one of them isn't. That's the standard way of thinking of it. Now, if you don't think you can, and if you read Scanlon, say, he explicitly says that's what he wants to do. He wants to characterize the actions in a way which is independent of the intention of the person who's, or the mens rea of the person who's performing that action. If you don't think you can do that, then you don't have a general doctrine of double effect. You only have it for those verbs which don't themselves build in this kind of intentional material. Now, I think it's interesting. In fact, I think if you look at the cases that are talked about under the doctrine of double effect, the core cases which look kind of persuasive, those are cases typically where they don't fall under the standard moral categories like murder, stealing, rape, whatever. Instead, they're cases where, it's like dropping a bomb. Yeah, so you've got the strategic pilot and you've got the terror pilot, and neither of those are really doing something that can easily be categorized under those kind of basic moral action categories. So there we can think, well, was he intentionally killing the children who were in the school that was next to the munitions factory? So the doctrine of double effect, I think, can still have application on those cases. But what's interesting about it is it's limited to the cases which in some ways are not, I think, at the heart of many of our moral practices. That is, it's not going to be there for murder, theft, whatever. Because you're not in general going to be able to do the separation that's needed. What can you say in those cases? Well, what you can say is that intention matters very much. Well, of course it matters very much, because under this picture, of course, it follows from your having murdered someone that you did something intentional. But I think in some ways, concentrating on the doctrine of double effect to highlight the importance of intention is exactly the wrong way of going about it. You should be highlighting the importance of intention for moral activity by looking at the core moral notions that build it in, rather than for these more, the ones in the interstices where it's not. Okay, double effect. Second thing I want to talk about, evaluative thick concepts. So now let's go back to the evaluative thick concepts. As you know, there are plenty of articles you can read about moral thick concepts. Nowadays, quite a few books come out in the last few years. There's lots of stuff there. I find it very striking how little discussion there is of what's at stake in this debate, though. So lots of people arguing whether there are or aren't morally thick concepts. Much less discussion of why it matters. I think there are two things that you find quite often talked about why it matters, and then I think there's a third which I'm finding actually the most interesting. So let me talk about the two which are talked about less, and then, which talk about more, but I find a bit less interesting, and then come on to the third. Firstly, people think that if there are thick moral concepts, then they will build in, of course, both descriptive and evaluative stuff. So something like Hume's distinction between never quite clear is and ought, or maybe evaluative and descriptive, is undermined by the existence of certain concepts. Yeah, that's one thing people do talk about. Second thing they talk about is to do with whether the concepts are world-guided or whether they are action-guided. This is something Williams talked about when he introduced the notion. Yeah, that's there. Now, if you've got thick intentional concepts, I don't think they are going to give you either of those things, unless you also think that thick intentional concepts are thick normative concepts as well. But that would be a further thing. But here's the third notion that I do want to talk about, and that I do think brings an interesting consequence even for the thick intentional concept. There's a discussion that Anscombe has in Modern Moral Philosophy when she is talking about the redundancy of the notion of ought. She thinks ought only has application within something like a command theory of morality or some theory like that. She thinks we've all lost that nowadays. And she says it would be much better to go back to the particular moral evaluations. So she ends up with something that, rather than thinking there's an overall moral notion, she thinks there are specific moral notions. And insofar as she has any space for the notion of ought, I think she thinks it's something like this sort of just conjunction of those, right? Things you ought to do is each of these things that it would be good to do in some much richer way. Now, that I think is something which is almost bound to be forced upon you if you have fixed moral concepts. That is, it gives rise to something like an irreducible conceptual pluralism, right? Because you can't. You've got to think your moral vocabulary is now just divided up into these different terms from which you can't just extract the moral bit. I think if you buy the idea that you can't disentangle the mens rea and the actus reus, then it's not a knockdown argument, but you are at least going to be very tempted now by the idea, by that same idea. Let's just think a little bit about why that should be. Well, you could buy the idea that there were these intentional moral concepts and think they had no central role in moral evaluation whatsoever. Yeah, you could buy that. So you could think, we have notions of murder and whatever, but I'm a utilitarian. I'm not really interested in murder. Insofar as I'm interested in murder, it's just perhaps because I'm some kind of raw utilitarian, and I think it's, that's the useful way of bringing about the optimal outcome. But I don't really think there's anything important there. Suppose, however, you do think there's something important there, so you think, it's not a surprise that the law is phrased in terms of these things, and that our native moral thinking builds out from these concepts. Now you're going to think that the intentional bit for each one is bound up with that particular concept, right? It's not floating free. So what isn't available to you, I think, is something which has the force of something like a subjective requirement. And this includes not just Kantians, deontologists, but also includes those utilitarians who think in terms of a subjective rather than an objective criterion, namely something like expected happiness maximization or something like that. Because if you think that the intentional thing is different, it is intimately tied to the action in a way that can't be separated, then you're not going to think that there's an overarching, at least you're very unlikely to think, that all the moral significance there comes from some overarching intention. Right. So, for instance, the intention to violate the categorical imperative, or the intention, failure of the intention to maximize happiness, or something like that. Intention there seen as maximizing expected happiness. So if that's right, that's what we get, I think. Now, I find this a very interesting picture. And I think it's interesting because it's kind of unstable. I find it both attractive and unstable. Right? It seems to be very implausible that you would think that our the only way of thinking about ethics, all of the ethical questions, everything had to be put under, is it murder? Is it rape? Is it whatever? That seems, what if it wasn't any of those things? You're just silent? That's no good. You can't think that way. So you've got to think there's some thinking we have to fill in all the other bits when it doesn't fall under these. Or maybe when these are clashing in some way, or there's some other problem. On the other hand, you still might think that each one of these is crucially important. And I think if you do a kind of genealogy of morals, I think this is very interesting. I would love to know more, but thinking, for instance, in recent years about the evolution of notions like sexual harassment, notions that just weren't there 40 years ago. Right? What you get is a set of diffuse things coming under different ways of thinking. some more broadly deontological, some more broadly consequentialist. And what you see is those starting to kind of come together under a single notion, which I think we then think of like an essentialist notion. We think of it in the same kind of way that we think of natural kind terms. That is, we think of it as something which we've got a grip on, we've got some paradigms of the application, but we don't fully understand, and we're still thinking it through, and we're ready to take criticism from other people on our grasp of it. Right? But we're trying to get hold of a particular notion which we think has some real application. Okay, now this is descriptive moral psychology, but my preference, my prejudice here is that in fact our normative moral psychology is not going to be dissociable from that kind of descriptive psychology. I've talked for long enough and I will stop.